These past 2 weekends of marathon running have been absolutely wild. We saw Kipchoge not win the Boston Marathon, we saw Evans Chebet repeat as the Boston Marathon champion, and then just a few days ago, we saw Kelvin Kiptum make a superhuman effort in the 2023 London Marathon, getting very close to Kipchoge's world record, running a time of 2 hours, 1 minute, and 25 seconds with an absolutely historic negative split. With so much action going on in the men's marathon right now, there are many people talking about the rapid rise of Kelvin Kiptum and potentially the decline of Eliud Kipchoge. But the reality is, we just have no clue what is actually going to happen. We don't know their next race. We don't know what Kipchoge's form is actually looking like. But I did want to mention something very unique that I haven't seen before, and it's specifically talking about Eliud Kipchoge's running form. Now, for anyone that has ever seen Kipchoge run, you can pretty much immediately see that his form is some of the best of all time. Running at 4 minutes and 30 seconds per mile, Kipchoge just does not look as though he's running that fast, which means that he has some of the best running economy in marathon history. With balanced arms, a super fluid motion during his stride, and a mental approach that makes him look even more calm, he really does have one of the best approaches to marathon running that I have ever witnessed, and this complete balance certainly makes him one of the greatest, if not the greatest, marathon athlete of all time. But right now, I want to talk about one specific article that I'll make sure to link down below that talks about Kipchoge's running form specifically in the 2023 Boston Marathon. Now, for Kipchoge's form in this year's Boston race, his form still looks very good. In fact, when you compare him to the other athletes in the race, it certainly still seems as though his running economy is much higher. But according to this article, something happened in this year's Boston Marathon that typically doesn't happen until the very later stages of a marathon. Even before the half marathon split, Kipchoge's right leg was starting to be placed in the very center of his landing area. Now, what this means is that his center of mass above his right leg was starting to become dead center over his right leg. It's a difficult thing to notice with the naked eye, but if you compare this year's Boston Marathon's running form to last year's Berlin Marathon, it is slightly more noticeable. In last year's Berlin race, he was looking smooth, as he typically does, and it does seem as though his center of mass never lands directly over either foot placement. And contrast this to the 2023 Boston Marathon, and it does become slightly more noticeable. Now, in this article, he talks about how over the previous decade, Kipchoge's form does start to fall apart when he's really pushing, and it usually starts to happen in the last 5 kilometers or so. But typically what Kipchoge does, better than anyone else during a marathon, is self-correct. And in his opinion, this happens throughout every training run, this happens throughout every marathon performance, and this is why Kipchoge certainly has been one of the most consistent and non-injury affected athletes of all time. Even in this year's Boston Marathon, various outlets were asking Kipchoge about his ability to stay healthy and injury-free. And while Kipchoge didn't mention any specific injuries, he basically said, look, injury is a part of sport, and we have to approach this in a responsible way during all of our training and all of our marathons. And this article basically says that Kipchoge talks about injuries in this fashion because this is just a part of his every single day activities. It's an interesting approach, and I can't say that I've ever done something like this, but imagine being so connected with your mind and body that you can literally self-regulate during your runs. This is an interesting approach, and I actually think there's extreme credibility to Kipchoge's strength and running form when it comes to his ability to stay injury-free. And it does line up with the way he talks, it lines up with the way he approaches life. I think it's completely credible. But what this article also states is that his form started falling apart much earlier in this year's Boston Marathon. Again, even before the halfway point, he was starting to land his right leg much lower than normal. And another interesting point is that when Kipchoge was running downhill, both of his thumbs were actually up during his stride, which typically doesn't happen during any one of Kipchoge's runs. Now, all of these things should be taken with a grain of salt because it doesn't necessarily mean that Kipchoge was deeply struggling, but it is highly correlated with the fact that Kipchoge was unable to compete with many other athletes on this day in Boston. In fact, this ties in perfectly with what Kipchoge said after the race, which is that he could not lift his left leg as high as he wanted to, so in order to balance himself, he basically had to put his right leg more underneath him so that he could find his way to maximize his body's sway motion. It's fairly complicated, and nobody can quite be in the mind of Kipchoge like himself, but he was very open after the race about this left leg issue, and it does line up with what this article states about his right leg placement. Now, what this article also states is that the fact that Kipchoge was able to self-regulate, still finish in 6th, and still finish in 2 hours and 9 minutes and 23 seconds on a rainy day and a windy day speaks volumes about Kipchoge's abilities still in the marathon. And it should be noted that with Kelvin Kiptum coming up in the ranks so fast, and Kipchoge still able to run fast but not quite as fast as we thought, their inevitable clash could be one of the most interesting marathons of all time. This article also states that Kipchoge clearly is not done, because despite running in the very challenging and competitive race that was this year's Boston Marathon, Kipchoge showed up and ran a fantastic race, and the fact that he was basically injured is some next level running. Now, he never actively said that he was completely injured, but Kipchoge doesn't talk about injury that way. He talks about regulation, he talks about the mind, he talks about running a quote-unquote beautiful race, and I think that's what he means. And I think that instead of throwing out predictions and specific times for a marathon, Kipchoge is more in tune with how he is going to feel during the race. If you'll remember, before last year's Berlin Marathon, multiple times he was stating that he just wanted to run a beautiful race. And clearly he did, because at 2 hours 1 minute and 9 seconds, that was a beautiful race. Nobody in the world could compete with him on the day. And while his finishing time was certainly beautiful, it's more his stride and his feel during the race that I think that he was concerned with. This full article really goes into detail about what Kipchoge has done over the previous decade, both with his overall performances and with his running stride form during each one of his races. Now, one of the absolute best examples of Kipchoge's form and how it actually results in his times was the Breaking 2 project back in 2017, when Kipchoge only fell 25 seconds away from the mythical barrier that was the 1 hour and 59 second marathon. For this race, Kipchoge was right on pace for the first hour and 55 minutes. However, over the final few kilometers, he really started to feel the heat and clearly started to feel the pain. And while his body was breaking down, he was actually resulting in a similar kind of running, with his body swaying a little bit more, his facial expression clearly showcasing pain. And I think this is a very important thing to note about Eliud Kipchoge. He is very talented at self-regulation and finding the kind of balance that can yield in such a consistent career, more so than anyone else has ever done in the past. I would very much encourage all of you to read this article at length, because it goes into the mind and body of Kipchoge more so than any article that I've read so far. So I'll make sure to link it down below, and I would love to hear all of your thoughts on how you think this affected Kipchoge this season. Was it more of an early leg issue? Was he simply unable to regulate because Boston is so hilly? Or was it a combination of many things we've talked about in the past, with his shoes getting wet, with the rain inevitably affecting his internal temperature, or like many things in life, was it a combination of all of these things? Also, make sure to leave your thoughts on what you think Kipchoge's next marathon should be, because in my mind, I'm getting pumped about the 2023 Berlin Marathon, because Kipchoge versus Kiptum could be a historic marathon. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, until next time.